you look at all the technical systems, including air conditioning in buildings, they're invisible. So typically you only fix them when they break. So the whole industry sort of tends to that reactive approach. So we find easily when we go into a building and we do an audit to understand the remaining life of the assets, typically easily 20 to 30% of the assets are being sweated way beyond their economic life. Now we've only got 4% of the market, but if you extrapolate those numbers, it runs into millions of assets. So there's a lot of buildings with second-hand clunkers in them. So that's the answer for that there's a lot of assets being sweated way beyond their economic life. And therein lies an opportunity. You know, if you want to improve the neighbour's rating of a building, try and replace with new, but you've got to put, as I said, a compelling business case. You'll reduce the operating expenditure. OPEX is typically recovered from the tenant as an outgoing. CapEx is paid for by the owners. So if you think about that, what behaviours does that set up? Put as much into OPEX as possible so you don't have to do any CapEx. Yeah. But if the outgoings get too high, the building then becomes not attractive for a tenant. So there's all those market forces at play, but there are misaligned interests here in terms of who pays for the OPEX and who pays for the CapEx. So a tenant has a misaligned interest to a landlord, and the best example I can give is, why would the landlord want to spend all this CapEx money to put a new lighting system in the building when it just means the tenant is now going to pay less outgoings for the energy? So look, they're not going to say that, but let's be clear. People will go, well, hang on, why should I do this CapEx and the tenant gets all the benefits? So how do you overcome that misalignment of interests?
That's a good question.
Well, what you have to do is deliver it as a service. In other words, put the new lighting in and the landlord can pay for it over 5 years, 10 years. And if the outgoings to the tenant actually go down, including the repayments, then in theory, that's going to be a win-win outcome for both the landlord and the tenant. Now, there'll be some landlords that say, but we can't do that. It's a CapEx item. Yeah, but if you deliver it as a service, you can overcome those requirements. And it's happening in a lot of other industries. So I think to do that in the built environment would actually then align the interests of the landlord and the tenant. And that's how you would then get you would have no CapEx. There'd be no CapEx at all, it'd be all OPEX, but it would actually reduce the running cost of the building, and so the tenants would actually end up paying less outgoings.
What about
80% of the licensed people in Australia, Grosvenor's not typical. You are, if not one of the biggest companies dealing in this sector in the country, if not the biggest. 80% of licensed people work for 1, 2, or 3 man bands. How do we help them? Because obviously, if we accept that that's a really good way to actually drive a whole lot of better outcomes, how do we help them change their market offering to meet this transition from repair to service?
It's all about taking what we've done within Grosvenor, but delivering it to the whole industry through software and data collection practices, not through Grosvenor, a separate entity, but effectively, and it doesn't have to be us, it could be any service, but it's about making sure that we give these people an opportunity to grow their businesses by being more proactive rather than reactive. It's about giving them, saying, if you manage to collect this information, which may cost you 10 extra seconds in terms of using your mobility app, but look at all these extra sales that could come to you because you're now going to give the customer a really good solution that's going to reduce his running costs and it's going to make the building more energy efficient. I think, and education, and there's a better way. And the best way to do that is to say, well, look at this better way. It helps this company grow, so you can help your company grow. So I think that's what we need to do.
What role do you think Fujitsu, but the companies that manufacture have in terms of helping tradespeople better understand their capacity to support consumers through maintenance, and what is it that you can do to help address that problem? And I'm thinking here, primarily about domestic customers with split systems, and then Kylie, is there a way that RRA could get involved? Because we know from the data that you've uncovered that there's an issue with split systems at the end of the life and getting refrigerant back. But the other thing that's likely in that actually is the life expectancy. This may be counterintuitive, of splits may, and I haven't thought this before, but potentially might be too long. That people are keeping their splits, so your data says 13.7 years. Maybe 12 years is a more reasonable average lifespan. And if you could convince people of the economic and the other benefits of replacing earlier, and can RRA help foster consumers to make that choice that's better for them, better for their costs overall, and better for the environment?
So from Fujitsu's perspective and a manufacturer's perspective, starting off probably, and which will filter down from a commercial setting, there's nothing more than we want than our R&D resource going into some pretty advanced technology and efficiency from an equipment perspective. But how we can sell this to the market is one of the easiest ways to do it is with a return on investment analysis. But how do you compare an existing unit, a clunker as we spoke to them before, which might have ERs and COPs now, but the unit's degraded, there's build-up, depending on the level of maintenance. How do you compare that to your new kit and still be objective in the data analysis? So the points Nick alluded to it's a benefit for the whole industry. I could see Nick and I working together and you could pitch to a client saying, well, here's how this could be a return on investment. This is how we could operationalise the product or service for the business. And that filters down into a residential setting, Greg, where for us, it's return on investment. So for us, from a replacement point of view, and you mentioned the 13.7 years, if people saw data to see the savings they could have and actually knew how to use the data, that's what drives decisions. We've seen it with some other industries like solar, that 5 years payoff period as a rule of thumb that has been thrown up. And the other side is education. So for us, we have Fujitsu General has a big reach and voice in the market. So the more that we can promote servicing equipment and the benefits of that, simple things, cleaning filters, and I always go back to how many people actually go and hose their outdoor unit. Probably not that many. But small things like that, it's, well, how can we quantify that efficiency gain?
So if we use the example of R22 equipment, which was really popular, but banned certainly for since the 90s through to even into the 2000s. What we just saw is that the government banned R22 equipment in 2010. And if we look at the average age of that equipment, the new 22 equipment now is approaching 13 years old now, right? So what we've seen is there's equipment installed even older than that that's still being serviced and still being used. And what RRA have looked at, again retrospectively, is what we've seen is RRA has encouraged the reclamation of R22, so that is the reprocessing brand up to brand new specification to put back onto the market. But the unintended consequence of that is that we've extended the life, or given this equipment, sort of artificially extended the life of equipment that wouldn't ordinarily, or would have been replaced earlier. So what we need to, certainly RRA are thinking about now is, what lessons have we learned from that, and how can we change that dynamic moving forward? And so we're not repeating the mistakes of the past with the lessons that we've learned and the experiences that we've seen.
How do we work together to align all our interests and actually make our nation more productive and more efficient and secure jobs and deliver outcomes that we all want in terms of environment, social governance, all those things?
One of the things, and I'm thinking very much of the tradespeople that may be listening to this, and I fully recognize and personally understand that change can be daunting and scary. I think here, though, we need to realize is as this industry has become increasingly professional, the amount of remuneration and the recognition of an air conditioning and refrigeration tradesman being a professional, providing a professional service has increased. Fridges now make more than any other trade. And I think as we move along a line of a data-driven approach, which talks about equipment, but talks also about the consumer-facing focus that tradespeople will have, there's an opportunity actually to make this an even more profitable industry for those tradespeople who can really get out in front of this wave and can lead this wave. So I think there's great opportunity here for the industry. So, yes, there's change. And people are going to have to adapt to the change. No longer is it just a ute with some tanks of gas in the back and some wrenches, spanners, and scales and whatnot. It will become increasingly technical. But in that, our capacity to deliver more to consumers really gets multiplied several times. And I think that's worth pursuing.
Well, going back a few steps to add to it around consumer education, and the GEMS and MEPS schemes are a really good benchmark to make a purchase decision on. But what GEMS and MEPS doesn't do is say, well, what outdoor ambient is your unit going to be operating at? What space is it installed in? So how efficient and effective that unit actually is versus going into a retail store or having a specialist come to your house can be a lot different. So I think for industry and tradespeople going out and dealing with consumers directly from a consumer perspective, it's educating the consumer on how to select, operate and maintain a unit effectively.